I do believe we are all good. That's just sometimes we've had some roadblocks along the way. We've had some things that have happened in our lives that have caused tension. And so there's some personal work there that needs to be done. But at the end of the day, I don't think anyone would argue with the idea of people achieving their highest potential.
In every single interaction, there comes a moment when we wonder, do you see me? Do you hear me? Welcome to the Heart to Heart podcast. I'm your host, Gayathri Shukla, and I'm the founder of Campfire Kinship, an organization building inclusive cultures through storytelling. This season is about exploring something that is core to being human, and that is our need to belong. So imagine gathering around a campfire with stories reaching your heart. I am partnering with CJSW 90.9 and recording in Kinsis or Calgary, a sacred place where the Bow and Elbow Rivers meet, and home to Blackfoot Confederacy, Tsuut'ina, Stoney Nakoda Nations, Métis Nation, and all residents of Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Heart to Heart. Today, I'm eager to connect with Erin Davis, a longtime friend, as well as a colleague in the equity, diversity, inclusion space. So I'll start with introducing Erin. Erin Davis is an award-winning expert in gender equity and inclusive leadership, dedicated to creating workplaces where all individuals can thrive. She is the founder and lead inclusion strategist at Erin Davis Co., where she helps organizations embed equity into leadership, policy, and workplace culture, driving meaningful change. Erin also serves on the Pride at Work Canada Thought Leadership Committee and the board of the Pride Center of Edmonton, advocating for systemic inclusion. Erin, I am so excited to welcome you, and you and I connected a little bit before this, and we talked about how recent trends within equity, diversity, inclusion, EDI has created this, I'd say, an environment of fear, right? And uncertainty, perhaps, where we've progressed and we see the cyclical kind of change and what seems to be a reversal. Where do we go from here and what do we do? So maybe let's start with your perspective and your own journey of how you got into the space and what you think EDI has achieved and how far we've come.
Yeah, actually, it is amazing to be here to have this conversation and to gain a bit of perspective, especially in the world right now where DEI, as the acronym is being used, feels like it's under attack. And never in my lifetime did I ever think that the work to make the world a better place would have this spotlight on it. But when we take a step back and I think about even my journey started over 15 years ago in this space, and it was early in my career and maybe a similar experience to you. The first 10 years of my career were really focused on figuring out what the landscape was, what did I want out of my career, learning a ton. And so in a way, my head was down, really focused on my own outcomes. How can I learn and how can I continue to advance within my career? I got to a point where I was starting to think about leadership and what that would mean in my career. And it coincided with a leader reaching out to me and asking if I wanted to be on a diversity and inclusion committee. And I tell the story that at that point, I didn't really know what diversity and inclusion was. Certainly, I could have waged a guess on what that would entail, but I really respected this leader. I said yes. And that was the start of my journey of really diving in, starting to research what is this diversity and inclusion work. And for me, it was around women in leadership. It was around women in leadership that looked like me. We both are in Alberta. It's a very energy-focused industry where we don't see a lot of women in leadership roles within that sector. And so I was like, okay, I want to fix this for myself, but I also want to fix this for the entire energy sector. I really want to think about this and how can we start to create pathways and figure out what are these unconscious biases that are in the way of women achieving their highest potential. That was the starting point. I'm always grounded by that, knowing we have not achieved gender equality. We have not seen a lot of change in terms of representation in leadership roles. There's still more work to do. And then rewinding the clocks on, we have this moment in time where DEI feels under attack. We've had a lot of moments in our time in this space, and I know that George Floyd is a big pivotal moment. It certainly is in my career in terms of going, I need to do more, and how that's how I started my business and saying, how can I help organizations understand how they can do more in response to those circumstances? But when we look at the clock, Black Lives Matter actually started in 2013. It came more into the spotlight in 2020, but that's a movement that has been worked on for a really long time. We have the Me Too movement, and I think it was 2017 or 2018 where we really started to say, hey, this is not okay. Sure, we have respect in the workplace policies, but we actually aren't seeing those behaviors replicated day to day, and women are being impacted. I quite often remember the Starbucks incident in the US where individuals were going to meet friends. They were Black. The police were called because they weren't seen as being welcome in that space, which caused Starbucks to actually shut down all of their Starbucks across the US and Canada and deliver unconscious bias training. That was a huge pivotal moment that really allowed us as practitioners space to talk about this. Asian hate crimes saw a huge surge during the pandemic. The Pulse nightclub shooting, which there have been several incidents like that. And then from a Canadian context, we can't forget about the unmarked graves. I share all those because the list is lengthy in terms of these moments where we have potentially lost humanity. We see that people are being left behind. We know that unconscious biases are having impacts on people. And it means that I won't stop this work. I know that it means the same thing for you, but it's a good reminder when we go, is this it? Are we done? And we're far from done.
We are so far from done. Thank you for sharing that context and history as well as a little bit of your journey here. And I can right away relate to what you said about how are we in a place where the work that we do, believing that it makes a difference in the world, is now being almost attacked and weaponized, right? And I
Totally.
reflect on that often. At the end of the day, this work is about trying to create a better world for everyone. And it is sometimes disheartening to see the reactions, which is not in our control either. And I recognize that. And I say this with also the perspective that there are many organizations that I have the privilege of working with that are still committed and beyond committed. They are beyond any performative actions and wanting to create real change. And so that, as someone who is a practitioner, that offsets sometimes the disheartening things that you see in the media and things. But at the same time, I think it raises a question like how have these shifts really impacted us? Because like you say, there have been many moments change was being advocated for through the Me Too movement, through the Black Lives Matter movement in 2013. And then before that, even as someone who comes from a country that was colonized. And I grew up in India for my junior high. And I remember having history lessons in the Indian independence movement and independence from colonization and Mahatma Gandhi and the nonviolence movement. All of these movements have existed for centuries.
Yes.
And I think it really is a fabric of society today, and it continues to shape how we view the world, and it also shifts language. I like that you talked about DEI because I'm often asked about what's the right acronym. Is it EDI? Is it DEI? And maybe we should unpack that a little bit too, is how do we even move beyond the acronym?
Yeah, no, it's such a good question. And everyone's lived experience, I think, has these moments in time that they can look back and say, there were people left behind. How we know these things aren't right. How are we going to create that change? And I just want to say as well, I think about the activists in our life. And I'm pretty strong to be an advocate, not an activist, but I don't ever want to forget what they've done for movements within the 2S LGBT space and Stonewall and Marsha P. Johnson, for example, like some real trailblazers that were real activists in the space. And without them, we wouldn't be where we are today. But advocacy takes a lot of work. And I think for us as practitioners is making sure that we're in a safe space to have a conversation, maybe with someone who is pushing back a little bit, or maybe asking some questions and going, What is the D? What is the E? What is the I? Let's have the conversation on the definitions, because I have been thinking back and going, maybe diversity became a bit of a misnomer and
Mm-hmm.
people felt that it didn't encompass them. It means everybody else but me as a white person, for example. And we know by definition we have diversity when we have two individuals in the room. We have different lived experiences. We maybe grew up in different places. We maybe went to different schools. We've worked in different jobs. We have different educations. But what we're talking about when we say diversity and what we're working on inside of organization is the underrepresentation of certain diversity dimensions inside of organizations. And so I'm like you, when I started this work, it was called D and I. And so my unconscious
Mm-hmm.
has like programmed that in, and it becomes a little bit of my default. I know in Canada, we see more predominantly the equity piece at the start, EDI. In the States, in the US, we sometimes hear JEDI with justice being thrown in. And then certainly we have the other acronym of bringing in access and accessibility, which we could have a whole other conversation on about how that gets left behind time and time again, and the accessibility
Mm-hmm.
movement. And there's so many trailblazers in that space. But I think we need to not use the acronym right now and really talk about what is it we're trying to achieve. Even when we talk about equity in the workplace, right? We are not all on a level playing field. And it's tough when we hear the terms like meritocracy being thrown out. And I'm curious your thoughts on that too, because I've worked in the engineering space and I know that's your background as well. And that would often come up so many times about merit-based hiring, and that, well, we have to hire the best. And for me, it's always unpacking. Help me understand what you mean by that, because we are missing talent when we think in such a linear way. But that is how engineers are trained.
Oh, I can certainly talk to the training that sometimes works in my favor, but sometimes I've certainly had to unpack some of the conditioning that I've had around linear thinking. But merit is a question that comes up often. And sometimes we forget that what are we really trying to achieve here? And I think what we're trying to achieve is having the right talent for the job.
Yes.
And that right talent may or may not look similar to the talent you've had in the past. I think, especially in engineering workplaces, we've had largely a homogeneous demographic. And even with women coming on, I know when I went to university, there were probably less than 10% of female engineers in electrical engineering, which is the discipline that I took. And when we look at having the right talent for the job, that might come from different pools, and pools that you haven't seen look like you if you happen to be in the dominant group, right? And so I worry that this term meritocracy implies that people of color or women or people with other dimensions of diversity that are underrepresented maybe do not already have the merit
Yeah.
and may be already not the right talent, right? Because that's the insidious implication of that is it's not one or the other. It is the fact that merit also looks like different shapes and colors, and it's okay to be open-minded to welcoming merit and understanding that may not be exactly what you had pictured in your mind.
Yeah, I think the meritocracy argument makes it a singular argument and doesn't open up all of those different colors as you and shapes that you described it as. It's saying we have to hire someone based on these qualifications. That's a given.
A
Would
given.
never. I always give the example. I'm like, no one's hiring me to be an engineer. I did not go to school for that. You're not giving me that job. But if it's a leadership role within an engineering firm where your job qualifications are leading a team and those are the outcomes that you're focused on, well, 100%. Like that's my skill set. That's what I've spent a much of my career doing. And so we need to take these steps back and really think about who are we not including. We know the research tells us. I'm laughing because I'm like going through all of these arguments that we've been taught as practitioners over the years, and I'm like, do they actually work? But for me, we just are leaving people out of the talent pools. And by not creating inclusive environments, which is what I really focus on in my practice, the women of color who go through engineering don't see themselves represented and self-select out because we haven't created the workplace culture for them. So that's the other side of this equation is what is the least risky thing you can do in your organization? Give someone a chance. Like we are talking like if this is the example in the engineering world, we're talking about $1 million, $1 billion projects. Hiring someone and giving them a chance and setting them up for success. I don't know. That sounds like pretty amazing to me. And when we foster talent and we grow talent inside of our organizations, then they will stay, they will thrive, they will be part of those leadership teams. And so if we can help people see beyond their biases and what they know, I think we really can start to change outcomes. And the entry point for people is different. And what I mean by that is how do we start that conversation with them, right? And so what is their pressure point? And I've been thinking a lot about this is, okay, DEI is in the spotlight right now. And so some people who maybe were on the fence or they're like, yeah, we need to do it, but I don't necessarily understand what it means for me and my job. It's helping them understand, are you having to work more because you are not at a full complement on your team? What are the workplace dynamics for you? If you're a leader, how much of your time are you spending doing what you need to be doing versus going out and recruiting and bringing new people into your organization? Like, what are their pressure points? I'd make an argument on like team dynamics and how women in the workplace actually offer this higher sense of collaboration and empathy. And I'm not saying that's missing from men in the workplace. I just think and it's been researched, it's a little bit more inherent for women to bring those characteristics into the workplace. And then all of a sudden, we actually have an amazing team dynamic and we're getting better outcomes and we are getting those projects done, if that's the example, and we just have a better workplace. And I'm trying to think about what are those pressure points now for folks and then bringing a solution that has a lens of equity, diversity, and inclusion
Absolutely.
tied to it.
I like the way you just framed that as the pressure points,
Yeah.
Erin, which is also in a way in engineering sort of a term.
Yeah.
You've worked
I
around
can speak the
engineers quite a
language.
bit. You totally speak the language. That's the thing, right? If you and I walk into any leadership room at any company, it doesn't have to be an engineering company, but any organization, and we don't see the representation of the community that they're serving at the top ranks of leadership, then that's for sure an indicator that there have been some pressure points in that whole talent pipeline that perhaps didn't enable other candidates to surface based on merit. We're not saying that you hire someone that doesn't have the qualifications, but what are the challenges or pressure points, like you say, that perhaps held them back? And it could be bias, it could be multiple things, right? And we know even maternity leave is a big topic.
Totally. Yep.
And I've heard that argument quite a bit of it's the women themselves who become mothers and self-elect to leave the workforce. But in reality, and in my own lived experience and so many other mothers I've talked to, no mother ever said to me, I lost all my ambition. Some do make the choice to stay at home, and that's a perfectly valid choice. And it's not just limited to mothers, right? Fathers as well. But that doesn't mean that they lack talent or ambition or potential or all of the things that are looked at as criteria to progress into leadership. And so let's unpack that pressure point and the biases that surround that.
Yeah, I think we're at that point where we need to think strategically about how we are initiating the conversations. I don't like to use the word fear for myself, but I do have fears, and I'm fearful of folks who maybe felt that they were silenced over the last 4 years, that they have been given permission to really share what they think. And I think we may be brought into more contentious conversations. So if we have built up our skills, which I know you will love having this conversation. How are we building up our skills of empathy and compassion? How are we showing up with humility? Because I will sit here and I will be in conversation with someone and I will always be curious to learn more. And this is maybe the controversial part of the podcast, and I think I shared this with you, but I've been taking some time to listen to podcasts that I wouldn't historically have listened to. Within my book club, and actually, it might be in frame here, we've read 15 books that are really good because we're learning about folks who've just had challenges in their lifetime and have faced oppression. But we've gotten to a point where yeah, we get it. But what is the other side, if we talk about it that way? What are they saying? How do we understand their perspective? Because you're either on this side or this side. That's what I see happening. And if we continue to have divides within our organizations, within our communities, within our cultures, within our world, then we are going to be further and further apart. But really, we're closer than we think. And so those fundamental skills of communicating across difference, to be able to sit in humility and going, and I'm going to make another bad joke, but that's another thing with engineers and a lot of technically trained folks. It's about being right or wrong. You even think about accounting, right? That is your job. It has to be done. There's no room for error. And so when we've been trained that way, we may think that way. And so we have to pull ourselves back from the technical pieces of how we're approaching things and think about things with our heart. And that's tough because a lot of us, myself included, it's a journey to go on to garner these skills, and to garner those skills when we feel uncomfortable. We go to our defaults. Yeah.
Absolutely. I say this with love and kindness towards my own younger self, but early in my career, I had a job where that sort of right or wrong perfection was actually life or death, because I was working in a facility with oil and gas, high temperatures, high pressures, high velocities. And if there's a loss of containment on a pipe, for example, because it wasn't programmed right, the valve wasn't programmed to open when it needed to open or close when it needed to close. And that was my job, was programming those valves and things like that. It literally could lead to environmental disaster, catastrophes, potential fatalities. And so we would apply a risk matrix to all of these things and go, with what precision do we need to have the exact answer for this type of thing? Totally. And so that's what I mean. Approach this with an open mind of curiosity, with an open heart of humility, and to really understand where is this other perspective. And I don't like the binary thinking that we find ourselves in, but I think that's part of the challenge of navigating this topic, especially in public spaces in the media and social media. It's there seems to be this, you're either right or wrong, and binary thinking. And let's take a moment to unpack, okay, what are the arguments that are coming from the so-called quote unquote other side? And I wonder, right, Erin, if you have a perspective, since you have been following these other voices and podcasts and things, do you have a perspective on where you think the criticism to DEI practice is coming from? And what could practitioners do differently, perhaps?
Yeah. I do think from the research I've been doing, which is a slow process, I will share that I have to put myself in the right mindset to dive into some of this. So it's been a bit slower to digest. I do believe some of it's rooted in a sense of feeling left out or feeling left behind. And this specifically comes to men and women in the workplace, and a lot of DEI efforts being focused on how do we get more women into the workplace? How do we make sure that they are advancing within their careers? When, again, remember back to my thinking about the definition of diversity, I do think white men felt that was basically saying everyone but you. And so as practitioners, our work, we need to make sure that these definitions are very clear and that my practice is rooted in inclusion. This is where we're trying to get to. That is for everyone. We all benefit from this. And it's easy for our brains to understand this or this. It's harder for us to work in thinking about how can we bring those together and get to a third outcome, a better outcome. Actually, this is my homework to go and figure out this research that was done. But when people have researched collaboration, even before researching inclusion, it tells you get a better outcome when you work collaboratively. You share all of your ideas, you work through those together as a team, and then you get to the best outcome. And so I think we are thinking in the binary on things, but it's our default and how our brain responds. So there's a fear of not being included. And then I guess I will dare say power and privilege comes into this in a huge way. And that is a multiple day conversation and unpacking. Ego can get into these conversations, the loss of perceived power in terms of our job titles or in terms of what projects we're in charge of. A lot of people's self-worth is tied to their work. And so if we don't do our own sort of inquiry on that, it can feel like a really big loss if we're saying someone else is going to take my job because they are a woman of color who has a disability, like where we start to like really label people rather than thinking about it in terms of what the skill sets are that they are bringing into the workplace and that we're holding people accountable to that. That's the other thing too, is I think we forget about that accountability part of the conversation. But to answer your question, I think there's fear. I think there's fear of being left out in these conversations, which is unfortunate because they are intended to be for everyone. And those who are, maybe I should say too, this is something I've been reflecting on. Those that are holding a lot of positional power are continuing to share a narrative, but we're also listening to it. And so that's why I'm trying to do a little bit of can I take a step back and whose voice within this are we not hearing and I can go and listen to so that I'm not bombarded with every day. The message in the headlines every day right now are DEI is under attack. It's a tricky one.
The most latest one was the recent plane crash, right? And President Trump blaming DEI for that. And that wasn't the first time that's happened. And it's interesting, Erin, as you're sharing, I just reflect on this aspect of not feeling included for, let's say, the white male, the majority groups even. And it is unfortunate because the premise of EDI was to include everybody and address inequities that have been historically in the system, right? Where I see the pressure point, if I can say that, being where this binary thinking kicks in and we either categorize people as you are privileged, you are totally privileged, as if they have never faced any obstacles in their own life, and which is just not true. I think if you're a human being, you've certainly had to overcome your share of challenges. And then on the other side, we hear of I am the full victim and I have zero agency to change my circumstances, and maybe antagonistic towards those who I see have achieved success because of purely their identity. And neither is completely true. And so how do we bring nuance into this conversation that allows for this complexity, allows for multiple lived experiences, and at the same time still gets to the heart of what EDI is trying to achieve, right? I feel like that has been the constant, the learning as well as the opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And we live in a society right now, and I think it hasn't been our entire lifetime. I'm just trying to think of what the reference point would be, but it's at least the last 10 years of easy button solutions where we can, whatever we need is at the click of a finger. And we've been trained to think that way, of the solution is right there. It's within reach. And as much as I would love that to be the circumstance, it's not. We've got to do a lot of work. We can look at it from different perspectives, but as policy change would be one in terms of, you mentioned maternity leave. What does parental leave look like? How are we encouraging, from a Canadian context, the use of those parental policies? I've had the opportunity to do some work in relation to the United Nations and start to think about policies on a global level. And we see in Scandinavian countries, policies being created for caregivers. And what does potentially grandparent support and helping raise a child actually do for your economy, right? And having them have purpose in their life, but also having a benefit to doing that. I think about flexible workplace policies and how that has ebbed and flowed, but that has impacts. But it's not an easy button, because anyone can call me on this one. We had flexible workplace policies before the pandemic that were in a corporate world in which you and I know, so we'll just do the reference point of Edmonton and Calgary, not a lot of people actually utilized. We go into the pandemic and we see people who are able to do their work from home are doing that because they cannot physically go into the office. And then we've seen what I will call an erosion against that policy and real pushback against we need everyone back into the office. And it's not easy because we have pushes of how society and urban planning has been designed to have people come to work in the core of their city. That's how infrastructure has been built. And so now we are saying no to that. And so what do? There's a lot of companies impacted by that. I'm a believer that there's many things that we can do. We've got to sit down and have that conversation because we know that things weren't working before. So if we go back to the way things were, people are going to get left behind. I heard a really powerful presentation from a woman who does urban planning in New York City. So I feel like that's pretty high credibility in terms of the number of people, the number of buildings. And she basically said, I'm a single mom and it does not work for me to be in the office every day of the week. And these changes actually help me do my job better. So that is one example, and I realize that. But I just think we do have a pretty loud voice of folks that are saying we need to make sure that we evolve these policies so that I can do my best work. And this is where, from an accessibility perspective, folks that would benefit from purely working from home in their jobs, who have maybe a disability, are maybe being told to come back into the office. And so it's like they're having to weigh, is it worth it for me to go and do my work that way? So there's lots of factors there, but I do think spending the time and the energy and the money to get better outcomes, whether or not we call it DEI, is so important because there'll be winners and losers, meaning people will want to work for companies who have policies that they see themselves reflected. My strongest argument on this is around generational differences. We have multiple generations in the workplace. And so I know that some of the generations are really comfortable going into the office, but others are not. The world is very different than it was 30 years ago.
Yes, for sure. We can order a cab at the click of a finger. We can order food at the touch of our phones, and perhaps this kind of quick fix outcomes is something that we're starting to be conditioned as, speaking broadly here, but it's a societal conditioning, and the work that we're trying to drive and the outcomes that we're trying to influence are not that, right? And so I'm curious, you have any examples that you might like to share around the impact that your work has delivered that you're really proud of or that gives you hope? And maybe what are some actionable strategies that you think leaders can take away, or anybody who's listening to this conversation and who's perhaps looking at their own equity, diversity, inclusion work within their organizations, and also seeing sort of these trends and backlash and fear arising, what might they be able to take away?
Yeah, so great questions. And I'm going to try to think of a couple examples on outcomes because you know this as much as I do. The stories matter. When you hear that singular story, right, of someone being impacted by their workplace, feeling that sense of belonging, that they are able to show up and do their best work, it is, I don't know, to me, the epitome of this work and should not be forgotten. I think maybe I'll just share a little bit more on that because I heard again through the work with the United Nations, just like how we need to support grassroots movements more than we do. And that sort of has given me permission in a couple different ways. It's given me permission to go, okay, who are we leaving behind in terms of our support and community? Because there's so many community groups that are doing really important work on the front lines. They really understand their communities and they understand where the gaps are. And so if they're not getting funding, they're not going to be able to create those changes. But I also think about it, and we want this, what is the silver bullet? What is the easy button? What is the one thing that's going to solve all of this? And I want that too. Like that would be amazing and make certain days less stressful. but it's the accumulation of all these small stories that create ripple effects that start to create change. And really, if you look at our history, I think that's how things happen. It's inspiring others through this work where they feel included, and then they show up in a different way, and then they show up with others in a different way, and then they have impact on those other folks. And so I think those stories, when you get the emails of folks just saying thank you for doing the work that you do. One story, maybe this is not related to my work that I get paid for, but I'll share because I think it's something it becomes an actionable strategy. I was invited to a networking event, and my default is check my schedule. Can I go book the ticket? But the organizer said in the email, make sure that you bring someone with you, or some type of language really encouraging a +1. And so that was enough for me to go, oh, right, Erin Davis, who else would benefit from coming to this networking event? And really thinking, because of course we have the usual suspects that come and have all these things on their radar, and they're going to be there. So I'm going to show up and I'm going to know someone. So I'm going to feel comfortable, and I'm seasoned in my career that I can figure out how to navigate the room. But some people aren't, and that can be intimidating. And so I paused, actionable strategy, pause in our like super dynamic world, and think about who could I bring along. So it's a mentorship angle that I really thought about. So I brought 2 young women who were earlier in their careers, who I've really enjoyed conversations with them. And I said, hey, I will be at this thing. I'd love for you to join. They did. Side note, which I think your listeners will enjoy, they are also women of color. So they look like me. They're of different ancestry, but they're brown women. And we walk into the space, and it was predominantly brown women. I don't even know what happened. There was like the worlds came together to really create this space. So it was really welcoming. So that's just a bonus to this story. But they messaged me afterwards, and they had such an amazing experience. So I picked the right event that had been created, that felt inclusive to them, that they could have conversations with, and then those ripples start to happen. And so even me is, oh, I should think about who else might benefit from coming to this. So not all solutions need to be big, but they need to have that impact.
Yeah. Oh, what a great example. And what I like about your story, and thank you for sharing, is also that you took the time, like you said, you paused and thought about who else could benefit. And I think that really does get to the heart of this work, is just pausing.
Totally.
Because often, and I'm guilty of this, I operate on my autopilot, and I'm making assumptions, and I am now even though I do this work on a day-to-day basis, pausing in that moment and going, what am I missing? Who else's perspective am I missing? Who else could benefit from this? And what assumptions might I be making? And that pause is what helps us to remain curious and be inclusive. So it sounds like the event that you went to, the organizers really took good care and creating inclusive gestures like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think it's a good reminder for us as practitioners, how are we thinking about that and how are we practicing that? And then I think my other outcomes in this work is the impactful conversations I have with folks who aren't quite sure of how to move things forward. So I have a client that I'm working with, and they have a committee that is working on anti-racism and anti-discrimination inside their organization. So no small feat. And I've seen this happen in a lot of organizations, and actually probably have too, where we get really excited to create a group, an affinity group, an employee resource group, or bring people together to solve like the biggest societal problems that we have. And they're like, here's $500 and
just do it off the side of your desk.
And do it off the side of your desk, right? And so then we become disenfranchised from this work because we're not getting any outcomes. And I argue you didn't really set it up to have outcomes other than gender equality or anti-racist or whoa. Yes, love that for us. That's what we're working towards every single day. But let's be reasonable. And the part of my story I didn't share at the beginning is I spent a lot of my early days in my career doing strategic planning. So it's how my brain's been programmed, what's our plan? How are we measuring
Mm.
success? What are the outcomes that we want? So there always needs to be a plan in place. It doesn't need to be 30 pages. It can be two, but how can we bring people together to focus on what are the actual outcomes we want to achieve? And so the biggest piece in that is tying it to corporate objectives, but we don't need to go down that rabbit hole. But I'm just saying, when people see, in this one client, when they see very clear and tangible ways that they can move this work forward, they start to go, there's hope. We are creating change, because otherwise they just get mired in these really big systemic problems and feel that they aren't accomplishing anything. And then we aren't getting any further along in what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah,
Yeah.
a clear focus on outcomes and also measurements, right? In a way, the
Yes.
engineer in me comes out again when I talk about
Yes.
measurements, but how do we know we're progressing in the right direction and what's actually within our sphere of influence to drive,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Because otherwise, you're right, we get mired in the systemic, huge, hairy problems that we actually don't have much control over.
Yeah.
Erin, I feel like I can keep talking to you, but I have two other questions for you. One is
Yes.
if you would just like to plug your business and how people can find you. And then the other question, I'll pause for your answer first, and then I'll ask you the other question, which is the question I ask all my guests.
Thank you. So my business is Erin Davis Co. I tell the story that it took me 7 months to decide that was the name. And now I go, maybe it's good that I didn't have equity, diversity, and inclusion in the title. But really, for me, it's about creating a more inclusive world, one conversation at a time. And how do I do that? I work with organizations to really build out what is your strategic roadmap to accomplish the outcomes that are going to help your organization become even better. I spent a lot of time in the education facilitation space because my favorite is just being in a room, ask me the quote unquote hard questions. Let's work through them together. I don't claim to be the knowledge keeper on everything, but I will go on that journey with you to figure out how can we continue to move this forward. And then most recently, I've been working with boards and really thinking about governance structures and how can we make sure that boards are operating effectively, meaning everyone who's sitting at the table has a voice. And this sort of relates to any employee resource group or affinity group as well inside of an organization. How do we make sure that we're setting you up for success so you have outcomes that are tied to the business so that you can feel that sense of accomplishment when you are working on these really big issues?
I love it. Thank you. And I will make sure to include your website link in the podcast notes.
Thank you.
And my final question for you is if you could complete the sentence, I feel a sense of belonging when.
I feel a sense of belonging when I can show up in any space and not have to think about what others are perceiving about me, what I'm perceiving about myself. I can just be me.
Can I just say that feels like you summed up our entire conversation in the perfect phrase of I can just be me.
Yeah.
And isn't that the kind of the point of this is for people to just be themselves and not
Mm,
encumbered by all of the assumptions other people are making or perceptions that now they're spending all their cognitive resources, which can be directed to their actual job, but
yes,
instead it's being redirected to having to overcome those biases and perceptions, right?
I know.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then continue to find space to upskill ourselves on how to interact as human beings. I think that's the one piece that I'll always push on against because I do believe we are all good. That's just sometimes we've had some roadblocks along the way. We've had some things that have happened in our lives that have caused tension. And so there's some personal work there that needs to be done. But at the end of the day, I don't think anyone would argue with the idea of people achieving their highest potential.
100%. And
Yeah.
that is, in fact, the reason that campfire kinship exists as well, is to unlock those stories and through that process, understand where each of us is coming from and where others are coming from and holding space to appreciate that diversity. And even if it's a lived experience or perspective that we don't agree with ourselves, can we understand and build those connections, build relationships, and start to even overcome conflict in a way where these tensions are arising from. And I know I often get this feedback around, this is the work. This is absolutely the work. It is unpacking our own story and holding space for others. Erin, I've loved every conversation we've had, and I've also loved the opportunities to collaborate together on projects, which we've done a few of, including events that we worked on together, and I look forward to more. Thank you so much for being here today on Hearth to Heart.
Thank you so much for having me and allowing us this space to start the day in such a wonderful way.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Hearth to Heart. I'm your host, Gayathri and Erin, founder of Campfire Kinship. If you'd like to learn more about storytelling, come visit campfirekinship.com. If you liked today's episode, hit the subscribe button and join us for future episodes. This podcast is being produced in partnership with CJSW 90.9 in Treaty 7 land in Calgary.